Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of our speaker series on rural transformations. This series is part of a project called Rural Development and the Capability to Stay, which is generously funded by the Social Science Research Council and the Center on Modernity and Transition. We are grateful to COMET and the Duke Center for International Development for co-hosting this webinar series. My name is Kerilyn Schewel. I teach at the Duke Center for International Development at Duke University, and I'm co-director of the Duke Program on Climate-Related Migration. Our conversation today focuses on the relationship between religion and development. It may be helpful to give some background for why we chose this topic. When the field of international development formally began in the years following World War II, its focus was almost exclusively on enhancing the material prosperity of peoples and nations. Embedded within the development enterprise were certain Western values, assumptions, and ideas about progress that assumed modernization would lead to a decline in religion. Despite the fact that the majority of the countries of the world were religious, and religion itself played a very prominent role in both private and public life, international relations, development efforts, and academic disciplines in the second half of the 20th century intentionally excluded religion. A purely materialistic view of reality and progress, together with Western models of governance, became increasingly entrenched and propagated worldwide. Over the last 2 decades, however, a confluence of factors led to what some scholars have called a turn to religion on the part of global development institutions. There's growing recognition that religion is not going away and even remains highly relevant in countries like the United States that are considered highly modern. Further, the evolution of the development field itself saw the rise of movements like the livelihoods approach, feminist theory, human development, and post-development, all of which called for greater sensitivity to people's beliefs and worldviews, which for the majority of the world involve religion. Finally, there's growing recognition that in many contexts, religious institutions are among the most trusted in local communities, where they have a track record of providing relief and support. Faith-based organizations continue to play a crucial role in the global development infrastructure. Over the last few decades, then, these various processes have led to gradually more systematic focus being given to learning about the relationship between religion and development. And recent advancements in thought and practice are what we hope to better understand today. I'm happy to let my co-host, Danny Duhart, introduce our esteemed speakers.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Duhart. I'm a sociologist at the Nucleus for Research and Teaching on Environment and Society, NIDAS, from the Academia de Humanismo Cristiano, University in Santiago. Today, we are delighted to welcome 2 experts working in the field of religion and development to our conversation. Emma Tomalin is Professor of Religion and Public Life at the University of Leeds. She's author of Gender, Faith, and Development, and Biodivinity and Biodiversity, The Limits to Religious Environmentalism. We're also happy to welcome Arash Fazli, Assistant Professor and Head of the Baha'i Chair for Studies in Development at Devi Ahilya University, Indore. He is co-editor of the book Reimagining Prosperity, Social and Economic Development in Post-COVID India. Emma and Arash, a warm welcome to you both.
So we like to begin our conversations by getting to know our speakers and their personal histories better. Emma, if we could start with you. In your academic publications and your work in various projects, such as the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith in Local Communities, you've helped a wider audience make sense of this turn to religion within the field of development. Can you share what drew you to this focus on religion and development in your own research?
Okay, so hello everyone. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for that question, Kerilyn, and also for the invitation to be part of this important discussion today. So my interest in religion and development actually began after my PhD when I got a job at the University of Leeds, so that was in 2001. My PhD had focused on the related topic of religions and environmentalism. So not so much religion and development, but religions and environmentalism, where I was interested in better understanding the various ways in which religion was relevant to the environmental movement, and the focus of my study was on India and Britain. And I was interested in the relevance of religion for environmentalism in practice, so in terms of lived religion, rather than the extent to which religious texts and traditions could be interpreted to support care for nature. So I was interested in how this was practically enacted in both Britain and India. So when I got my job at Leeds, one of the modules that I was invited to teach on was on the topic of religion and development. And this had actually been started some years before by a well-known scholar of Christian history, Adrian Hastings, who had spent large parts of his career in Africa. And when I began to prepare my lectures for the module, and I was quite used to preparing, you know, as a young lecturer, you're quite used to preparing lectures on things that are not always your specialist topic. I was somewhat alarmed by the distinct lack of publishing in this area. And that's certainly something that's been addressed today to some degree. But there was a really strong interest from students in this topic, even if at this time there was very little evidence that a religions and development field existed or was even beginning to develop. So alongside getting my job at Leeds and beginning work on this module, it was actually an MA module. At the same time, I was introduced to Michael Taylor, and he was the former director of Christian Aid. And at that point, he had taken over running World Faith Development Dialogue, an NGO, and he was based in Birmingham. And he was looking for someone to do some part-time research for them, and I fortunately secured that position. And I learned that World Faith Development Dialogue had actually been founded in the World Bank in 1998 by James Wolframson, the president of the World Bank at the time, and Lord Carey of Clifton, who was then the Archbishop of Canterbury in the UK. And the World Faith Development Dialogue is now run by Catherine Marshall at the Berkeley Centre for Religion, Peace and World Affairs at Georgetown University. So it's really flourishing and is one of the main contributors to debates and research about religion and international development. So I very much begun my work on religions and development, both as an academic, but also carrying out research for an NGO. And that's something I very much continue to do to this day. But particularly the publishing was a real struggle. At the time, so this would have been the early 2000s, it was near impossible to publish on the topic of religion and development in development studies journals. And that's really where I wanted to make a difference. I mean, I knew I got published in religious studies journals, sociology journals, but I was really keen to, break through into development studies. And I think there's very much a perception that articles on religion and development was some kind of front to promote religion. I mean, development studies is a very secular, left-leaning discipline. And there was this assumption that articles perhaps were trying to promote religion rather than just really argue for the relevance of religion to thinking about development. But there was also quite open hostility to engaging with the topic of religion and faith actors, often in policy and practice. But probably the most significant turning point for me was the decision of the UK government's Department for International Development, so DFID, who put out a call for a research centre to focus on the topic of religion and development. And this was about 2004. It was to be a 5-year project. They were funding it to the tune of about £3.5 million. And I was fortunate enough to be part of a successful bid by the University of Birmingham. And we set up what we call the Religions and Development, or RAD, research programme, which produced over 40 working papers on religions and development. And we predominantly focused on Nigeria, Tanzania, Pakistan and India. And this ran between 2005 and 2010. and the data I collected and the experience that I got during this research program enabled me, by the end of the project, to write my first book, which was my first book on this particular topic, which was called Religions and Development in 2013, published by Routledge. And there was a very interesting study done by Kurt Alan Verbeek back in 2000, where he looked at a series of development studies journals to understand or to map the frequency within which the words spirituality, religion, and so on appeared in development studies journals. And just to give you some kind of indication, there's a slide I often use in my teaching to illustrate this. In the journal World Development, between 1982 and 1998, the word spiritual and spirituality were not mentioned at all, and the term religion or religious was only mentioned 5 times according to his analysis. And then I repeated this analysis for, I think, 1998 to 2017 for world development, and came up with a figure that was around 700. So, you know, there's been a real change in this period and a real growth in a discipline and the emergence of a subfield of religion and development within international development studies. What was really striking, though, in the early days of writing about religion and development, that so much of the literature that we were producing was focused on making a case about why religion matters and considering religion as important, and to try and convince those who felt it was irrelevant, outdated, and only a problem. But what we've begun to see over the last few years is a shift, with some articles and books now critiquing some aspects of the religion and development field. So we almost have a field now that we can begin to look back on and think about how we might improve and develop it. And some of the areas that have emerged in terms of critical reflection is the ways in which perhaps donors are, or the aid business is instrumentalizing religion to meet Northern secular development goals. They're very interested in the kind of tangible assets that the religions can offer, like resources, buildings, networks, trust, and so on, to the expense of thinking about perhaps more spiritual or intangible aspects. And linked to this, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on, others were very critical that the main focus of this literature had been on formal faith-based organisations, ones that looked like secular NGOs. And at that stage, there was very much a lack of attention to the very local faith actors, who in fact may not even view themselves as faith-based organisations. So there's been whole debates in this literature about what FBO or faith-based organisation actually means. So just to sort of finish off with this introduction, you know, despite these sort of setbacks and hindrances, today religions and development is very much a growing and vibrant field. I've played a role in establishing 2 working groups or units in scholarly associations on development studies and religious studies. So one within the UK Development Studies Association, we have a unit on religion, a study group on religion and international development. And in the AAR, we have a religion and international development unit. And they've both been going, I mean, the AAR one for well over 10 years now. I co-edited a Routledge book series on religion and development, which would have been, you know, unthinkable 20 years ago. And I continue to teach undergrads and postgraduates, as well as to supervise PhDs in this area, and also to examine PhDs in this area. So, you know, it's a really vibrant and growing field, and I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about it.
Thank you very much, Emma. And Arash, in your recent co-edited book, Reimagining Prosperity, you write that the prevalent focus on economic growth as a goal of development needs to be replaced by a broader focus on human well-being. which includes the spiritual, material, and social dimensions of life. What experiences have led you to this conviction that the field of development should directly engage the social and spiritual dimensions of life?
Thank you, Danny. I'll just give you a little bit of context in terms of why we wrote that introduction and the background to the edited volume. Basically, after as a consequence of the pandemic, what we found was scholars in different disciplines related to development, whether it be water governance, whether it be agriculture, somehow had come to this conclusion that fundamentally the system that exists for addressing the needs of the masses was not working, and it was not, and there seemed to be a very compelling need now to do something about it. And that what needed to be done could not be a superficial tinkering with the system. Something fundamental needed to change. And in the context of that, that realization, the scholars who contributed to this volume basically went back to the fundamental questions of how we conceive who we are. You see, what is the whole systems of knowledge on which economics, I don't know, all the different social sciences and behavioral sciences are based. There was this understanding that somehow the assumption that people, if you go with the assumption that people are self-interested, utility maximizing agents, that foundation gives you theories and systems which will not allow us to solve the problems of the kind which the pandemic threw up. The reality of the pandemic showed us that this was an extremely interconnected world. It was a dynamic world that we lived in. It was a world that was rapidly evolving. And the knowledge that was needed to keep up with this world was somehow inadequate. It seemed to have been conceptualized for a different world. So when thinking about what insights seem to be missing in the way human nature is conceived, in the way the object of development, which is the human being, is conceived, time and again there was a going back to the lived experience of people. That how do people actually think about themselves, especially in the context of India? And sure enough, what was found was that people have a strong sense of themselves as spiritual beings. Religion is part of their it's the system of knowledge that helps them construct their moral universe and their sense of identity within it. And not just themselves, it also gives them a sense of their connection with others, their solidarity with others within their communities, their sense of right and wrong. And somehow it seemed that at a time of crisis, in a highly interconnected world, one of the missing ingredients in the system of knowledge that exists in the secular world is knowledge about human nature that would somehow inspire people to go beyond self-interest, to sacrifice, to form bonds of solidarity, to cooperate. And here was religion that very naturally was doing it. There were communities that were doing this for thousands of years. So for me, this was the context really in which in which we made these statements that that really the conception of well-being, unless it is broadened to include those dimensions of human existence which people feel most feel is perhaps the most compelling aspect of their reality. Unless that is accommodated. Now, how that is done is another question, but at least one can acknowledge the problem and begin to dialogue, to generate knowledge about ways in which a more fuller, a more rounded conception of human well-being can serve as the basis of our understanding of prosperity. And also for me personally, I've been associated before working with the Baha'i Chair for Studies in Development. I've been associated with the Institute for Studies in Global Prosperity for nearly a decade. And the Institute was one of those organizations that from its very beginning, its inception, focused closely on the question of how science and religion, as two systems of knowledge, need to come together to inform the thinking and the practice of development. And this wasn't, of course, just the Institute. Like Emma was sharing earlier, the turn towards religion was really a process that somehow many scholars, practitioners had somehow come to because of the realization that the way development had been conceived after the Second World War, somehow that conception of development had, despite the investment of tremendous amount of resources, the best minds in the world were dedicated to pursuing its end, investment of huge amount of resources. Yet unfortunately, the most basic problems of humanity, which is the problems of poverty, just wasn't we hadn't arrived at a solution to it. The question of justice, the question of bringing people together. So there was a much broader soul searching within the development community about what went wrong with the thinking around development. And people, sure enough, found that researchers found that when the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of development are, their lives are examined, one finds that they don't think of themselves the way that development theory, at least in the more traditional way, conceptions conceived of them. And that if one wants to truly elicit their participation in the processes of development, then somehow the way we think about development cannot exclude the way people themselves think about who they are and what their purpose in life should be. So for me personally, these were some of the different reasons behind pursuing this area of study and exploring development through this lens.
Thank you, Arash. Well, we would like to, this is all getting very interesting, so we will now like to explore a bit more the relationship between religion and development. So Emma, your recent project titled Keeping Faith in 2030, Religions and the Sustainable Development Goals. Recognize that religion remains a major cultural, social, political, and economic factor in countries around the world. You have written that religion is increasingly being recognized as a human resource rather than just an obstacle for development. In what ways have global development processes treated religion as an obstacle to development, and how do you see this changing today?
Thanks very much for that question, Daniel, and thanks also for mentioning our project, Keeping Faith in 2030, Religions and the Sustainable Development Goals. I just want to briefly say something about that and then answer your question about obstacles. So that was a project that I led with my colleague Jörg Haustein from Cambridge University. And specifically, we were interested in how faith actors very broadly conceive this as a very broad category, including both formal faith-based organisations, congregations, religious councils, etc. So I'm using that term in a very broad way. So we were interested in how faith actors have been part of the consultations to set the SDGs in the run-up to 2015, because after all, the UN, I think, claims that to decide the SDGs, they carried out the largest civil society consultation that they'd ever held. And we were also interested in finding out about how faith actors were implementing the SDGs. So we carried out our research in Ethiopia, India, and the UK. And the overwhelming response, just very briefly from our participants, was that there had been no separate consultation for faith actors. And when they had been involved, so large international faith-based organisations such as World Vision International and Islamic Relief Worldwide, they'd been invited because they were major NGOs that already had an existing relationship with the UN. So they were already at the table, and they weren't invited specifically, as far as they understood it, because they were faith actors, and not invited or enabled to make any kind of faith contribution specifically within those consultations. By contrast, the local faith actors, so those working at the very local, the small organisations that might be very informal and not well known internationally, those that we spoke to had not been in general specifically invited to participate in any of the consultations. So there were national consultations and regional consultations that happened, and they weren't invited, and they didn't know that they were going on, so they had no knowledge of them. And one of the things I'm sort of quite interested in promoting or beginning to think about now is how, you know, as activists, advocacy organisations, and academics, we can think about how we can perhaps enhance the appropriate engagement of faith actors in the discussions that are going to begin, I would imagine, quite soon, around what's going to happen post 2030, after the SDGs supposedly will have run their course. So I just wanted to say a bit about that project because you mentioned it. But turning to some examples of where religions have been treated by as obstacles, I think there are very many examples of this. But my own research has focused on two in particular. So first, with respect to the study and the practice of gender and development, which took off in the 1970s and the 1980s, when it was realised that the benefits of development, so the project that developed after the Second World War, were not always reaching women due to gender inequality. And gender and development initiatives and the academic literature on gender and development tended to have a very secularist approach, influenced by second wave feminism, where religion was seen as inevitably patriarchal and an impediment to women's progress and their fight for equality. And this view about religion as a negative force for women's rights and empowerment quite rightly drew attention to the problematic role of religion for reproductive rights, and also because of the way in which it influenced in many places social structures that view women as secondary to men. But rather than this observation about the negative role that religion could play, giving rise to the serious study of religion and gender in development studies, this negative appraisal, I think, tended to end up meaning that religion was ignored or dismissed both in the literature and in practice. And I think what this ended up meaning was that the negative role of religion was actually very poorly understood. But also, if we ignore religion, then we're unlikely to be able to take full account of the different factors that impact upon gender inequality and that therefore impact upon women's development and opportunities. But also, I think importantly, in highly religious settings, it can actually be much more useful and desirable and a choice made by women to work within religious frameworks to seek justice, fairness, equality, equity, you know, whatever you want to call it, in terms of uncovering teachings and practices that promote the more egalitarian treatment of men and women. So I think gender is one area where religion has overwhelmingly been treated within development studies as a problem rather than as an opportunity. This is beginning to change though. So until the 2000s, there was virtually no literature at all on the topic of religion, gender and development. So there were a couple of special issues of the Oxfam Journal. I don't know if anyone knows that, Gender and Development, that broke this trend. They had a special issue, in fact, in 1999. And I think that issue more focused on culture, this safer proxy term that's often used in development, particularly earlier on, rather than religion. And in 2006, they had another special issue that was much more squarely focused on religion. And in 2011, they asked me to publish an edited book, bringing together the best articles. So I got to choose the best articles, the articles that I perhaps enjoyed or felt were the most significant, from these two special issues into one place. So I edited a book called Gender, Faith and Development. And the collection very much emerged against the backdrop of questions, and these were questions posed by Caroline Sweetman, the editor at the time of the journal Gender and Development. And she was asking why much development thought had dismissed religion, its rituals and its customs as at best irrelevant and as at worst a barrier to economic, social and political progress. And she argued that this has had and continues to have a dramatic negative impact on economic, social and political development and the attainment of equality for women. So in the edited book, it actually introduced a series of case studies, really. Each of the chapters was a journal article about a particular topic or case studies. So just to give you an idea, some of the areas included tackling HIV and AIDS with faith-based communities, learning from attitudes on gender relations and sexual rights within local evangelical churches in Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe and South Africa. There was another article on how women's lack of opportunity for full ordination within Thai Buddhism played a role in sexual exploitation. That was my article that I published in the 2006 edited volume. How women engaged in witchcraft rituals in Kenya as a response to their marginalization from market gardening as the community and the economy moved towards cash cropping and men took over their traditional roles in market gardening. Fantastic article by Catherine Dolan. And then also an important article on the relationship between abortion reform and religion in Latin America. So there are many more articles, but really looking at these complex relationships between gender, religion, and development. And I think in addition to gender, a second area that only recently, perhaps the last sort of 4 or 5 years, I've begun working on has been to do with peace and conflict studies. And there's tended to very much be a view, I think, traditionally, and it's changing, of religion as only a problem. In the literature on peace and conflict, religions tended to be viewed as primarily a cause of conflict and violence, so particularly against the backdrop of reactions against terror and violent extremism. And I do think this essentialization continues to this day, particularly in the media, you know, how journalists talk about religion and its role in politics and violent extremism. But I think there is now also a greater recognition of the role that religion can play in peace building and reconciliation. And of course, many of us will know one of the most influential texts to really begin to argue for considering the role of religion in peace building as well as in conflict and the relationship between the two was Scott Appleby's The Ambivalence of the Sacred. So a very influential text that was really one of the sort of texts that acted as a turning point in how we think about the role of religion in peace and conflict. And perhaps I'll say a little bit more later on about my current project on peace building. But they're two of the main areas, gender and peace building, where I think particularly religion has been seen as a barrier, although this is beginning to change.
Thank you. Yes, like you mentioned it a little bit, but what have you learned about conditions that enable religion to be a resource for development then? Or like maybe looking at the other side.
Okay. So, I mean, I think this very much depends on what we mean by development, and that's such a dull question that I always start with. I mean, it's an important question, but, you know, it's one I always inflict on my students right at the beginning of the course and, you know, encourage them to, you know, examine in their essays. So, you know, whether we mean by it the sense of agendas set by the global north that may or may not be in tune with what people want and need in the global south, or other visions of development shaped by religious systems, for instance, that might be more likely to reflect local needs and interests, even if they aren't always in tune with the visions of progress and development pursued predominantly by the global north development actors. So I think there are three main things that I really want to sort of emphasize here that could enable religion to be a resource for development. So I think firstly, there's a need for much greater faith literacy within the development, humanitarian, peace building sector. So not just about what religions supposedly teach, you know, not about the teachings and the values and so on, and the history of those religions, but I think even more importantly, how they're actually lived out in their wider context. And this, I mean, this work takes time. This requires in-depth ethnographic work, carried out in particular settings on particular topics, you know, that ideally could be part of the evaluation of programs and the design of projects initially. So requiring sort of more in-depth ethnographic work rather than just looking at religious texts or asking religious leaders who are usually male to inform us about the relationship of religion and development. So I think we need a much more holistic, in-depth and nuanced look at how religion is actually lived within particular communities. And I think sort of linked to this, in order for religion to be a resource for development, and I've already alluded to this, there's a need to include voices beyond male religious leaders. I mean, so often, and again, less so today, but so often even now, just because most religious leaders are male, you know, if an organization wants to hold an event and they want to find out something about what religion means within that particular context for development, they're going to invite the religious leaders and they're going to end up being male typically. So I'm thinking particularly about inviting women who might have less traditional leadership roles within faith communities, and also youth as well. So, you know, youth are the ones that, you know, their futures, their aspirations are at risk from a lack of development and instability and fragility within their settings. And they often have very, very strong motivation to bring about change, and they really do need to be included, and often also very committed to their faith traditions in many settings. And finally, I might come back to this later, but you know, a very contentious issue actually, that I think for religion to be a useful resource for development, there possibly needs to be a willingness to much more carefully navigate sensitive issues such as reproductive rights and LGBTQI+ issues. And I think to recognise that not all faith actors are going to be allies on these topics. These are difficult topics for many faith actors. You know, and perhaps we then engage with those faith actors on other topics, or we identify other allies when it's, you know, when it's necessary to pursue reproductive rights and LGBTQI+ issues. And I think this is something that's beginning to be talked about more within the faith sector. But it's difficult for faith actors to raise because they don't want to be perceived as, you know, lacking humanity, as not being against people's rights and so on. But you know, it's a challenge that exists, and it's a challenge that needs to be faced and navigated perhaps more sensitively and carefully than it has done to date.
Thank you so much, Emma. Arash, if you have any thoughts on the question we posed to Emma, you're welcome to share them, but I'd also like to ask something a bit more specific about your collaboration with the Institute for Studies in Global Prosperity. Together you produced a paper, Hope and Resilience, the application of spiritual principles to community life. And that paper explores how communities in Indore, India, apply spiritual principles to address some pressing development issues, including the management of scarce water resources. So I wonder if you could just share some of the key findings that came out of that research project.
Yes, thank you, Kerry. Oh, just with regard to the last part of the question you asked, Emma, I was just thinking a little bit while the discussion was going on about, you know, what it means to call religion a resource for development. You see, and I think this is part of the maybe a bit of the challenge that when one looks at religion through a secular lens. I think the challenge becomes that you know, what makes religion work is the idea of the sacred, which is at the heart of it. And the idea of the sacred assumes that it is above mundane reality. It's above. It's even above depending on which religious tradition one is looking at. It's even above human comprehension, and that somehow one you know, aligns one's life in relation to it. So I think you know, one of the obstacles actually can, in terms of how one relates to religious people thinking from within a religious worldview, is that in looking at their reality from within a secular framework, one takes away the fundamental essence of their whole worldview, and then so in a sense the discussion that follows already has put the person from religion at a great disadvantage. You know, they are talking about something in a language and in a way in which they have to find a way to bring their reality back into the discourse. So I just wanted to problematize that a little bit. But then going back, and this is somehow related to the question of this study that we did with which Kerry was referring to, which is Hope and, I mean, it was published under the title Hope and Resilience. This study was basically a continuation of a series of studies that the Institute for Studies in Global Prosperity has been conducting, which tries to capture what spiritual principles look like in the lives of people, organizations, and communities, how people articulate these principles in relation to the various processes of their lives, their work, their community life, the way they deal with challenges, and how they operationalize. I don't want to, I mean, that's probably not the best word to use for spiritual principles, but how they put into practice these principles in very practical ways, but then without taking away the soul of that principle, which is its spiritual nature, their sense of a connection with a higher reality. How it does not, like I think Emma was mentioning at the beginning, that there's always been this concern within the literature that religion gets instrumentalized, that it becomes a tool to achieve an economic end, or some other maybe a very laudable end, but yet it's not from within the logic of religion. It's not within the worldview of religion. So somehow we try to, in these studies that we did, we try to capture in the language of believers in a way that is accessible to everyone, what their convictions look like in terms of helping them deal with social and economic challenges. So this particular study was done with 2 informal settlements that are based on the riverside of 2 rivers in the indoor city. Now those rivers have dried up, and these informal settlements, usually the land that is on the banks of these rivers is the least expensive real estate in the city, because these rivers have turned into sewage canals, and no one wants to, that's the least desired piece of real estate. So it ends up being the place where informal settlements come up. And these 2 informal settlements that we studied, one was majority Hindu, the other was majority Muslim. And when we spoke to the officials, the municipal officials, the government, urban planners, to see how they talk about these people living in these informal settlements, we found that they basically refer to these people as having no capacity, beneficiaries of development, state, different forms of state welfare programs, or NGOs providing some kind of development assistance. But basically they refer to them as problems, right? As people who have nothing to offer, but a lot of needs. Now, what we did is, for our study, we said, let's go and see how people in these 2 informal settlements deal with community problems related to water, which is basically their problem of water shortage and flooding. During monsoons, the river fills up and their homes get submerged. And we wanted to specifically see how their spiritual convictions help them deal with these challenges. So what we found, one of our findings was that people draw upon their spiritual conviction, their religious beliefs, really, in terms of forming community bonds, very tightly knit community bonds, where there are relationships of mutual assistance, reciprocity, in a way that is very closely knit. It's an everyday practice of reciprocity. It's not something that happens whenever you are in need. These people need each other every day for almost all their processes of life because of their circumstances. And we found that in doing this, and in avoiding conflict, in finding ways to address their common challenges, they constantly drew upon their religious convictions. And when they described their motivations for doing what they did, it was in the language of religion. And then also what we found, that this was not limited to their social life. It permeated to the other aspects of their lives. For example, in their economic relations, there was a lot of credit. And that was based on trust, which again, they, their rationale for helping each other, for trusting each other, was again described in terms of their spiritual conviction. And lastly, I don't want to take more time on this point, but the other thing we found very interesting was these communities. Interestingly, in India, there's a discourse. I mean, there's this reality of conflict between Hindu and Muslim communities, and this has a long history. And there's a perception that these two communities have a lot of tension between them, and it probably is not the easiest situation to have them together and have a common community life. But what we found is that each of these communities has a long tradition going back to in some cases more than 100 years, a long tradition of syncretic practices of community life and share, participating in each other's religious observances, consciously reading their religious scriptures in a way that accommodates the other, right? So one could see that there is a deliberate attempt to interpret scripture in a way that that makes the other, which in the wider discourse is talked about as an enemy, as actually a brother, a family member. And they have practices within the neighborhood that have cemented these relationships, and they are passed on from one generation to the next.
Thank you, Arash. Emma, you're part of the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities, which tries to bring in local actors and their voices more centrally into development policy and research. Building on what Arash was sharing about these local communities, can you tell us more about your initiative? And more specifically, do you see differences in how the development field engages religious perspectives at the local versus at the national or international level?
Yeah, thanks very much for that, and thanks also, Arash, for your comments as well. So the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities, or the JLI for short, it was founded in 2012. I didn't actually become involved, I don't think, till about 2017, 2018, but it was set up in 2012 specifically around this issue of engaging with local faith actors. So in particular, they wanted to engage the capacity of local faith actors in the humanitarian and development field, particularly by enabling them to build effective partnerships with public sector and other secular entities, as well as among religious groups themselves. So it was really born from a recognition that this field of religion and development that I mentioned at the beginning had been emerging sort of by 2012 for about, perhaps the last 5 to 10 years before, but it had largely concentrated on the contributions of what we might call international faith-based organizations. So I've mentioned a couple of those already. So organisations like World Vision International, Christian Aid, Tear Fund, Islamic Relief, and so on. A very Christian-dominated field, actually, perhaps something we can return to later on if there's time. So engagement and academic research had largely focused on the contributions of these international faith-based organisations, and local faith actors' roles, such as what Ashraf was just talking about, had largely been ignored. And I think there are a number of reasons for this. So I think local faith actors are more difficult to locate and to research and identify. It's very easy to find out about World Vision and to find the person to contact for an interview, because they have a fantastic website and a great communications team. So I think local faith actors are much more difficult rather to locate and to research than the larger formal international faith-based organisations. But also I feel at the early stage, the academic field largely followed the donor trend, which still continues to this day, of focusing their attentions on formal faith-based organisations. So these organisations like World Vision and like Islamic Relief, that although are faith-based, very much look like and act like secular NGOs. So they know the development language. They were invited to participate in the consultations on the SDGs before 2015 because they're known to be significant figures within the aid environment. But also those organisations, something we perhaps not mentioned yet, have also learned to strategically minimise the expression of their faith identity and to keep that in the background when they're collaborating and in conversations with secular organisations. So they very much keep their faith in the background. And these have tended to be the organisations that have had access to donor funding and have received most attention in the literature. And I think local faith actors can potentially be much more challenging partners for secular development donors and aid donors and NGOs due to their lack of knowledge, often, not always, but often, about the humanitarian and development business, about humanitarian principles, humanitarian standards, etc. The fact they might have very informal operations, but also that they might be very expressive about their faith identity, including some kind of concern or fear that they might be interested in evangelizing or proselytizing, trying to convert people alongside their other activities. So this was very much the background for which the JLI was formed. Before I go on to outline some of the activities of the JLI, it's also important to mention something about the joint learning focus, which is between scholars, policymakers, practitioners, and faith actors. So groups that often don't come together very well, like academic journal articles are often, behind paywalls and inexpensive books, and are often written in a way that's very inaccessible to practitioners and faith actors. So it was an attempt to try and bring, not an attempt, a successful attempt, an initiative to bring together these different types of actors so they could learn from each other, they could gather evidence together and set the research agenda to meet their different needs and outcomes. So more specifically, the JLI has focused its work on a series of learning hubs. So if you Google Joint Learning Initiative for Faith and Local Communities, I mean, maybe we can put it in the chat. You can see some information about the different learning hubs that they operate. So it's focused its work typically up until now on a series of learning hubs, which are typically chaired by an academic and a non-academic. And the learning hubs have typically begun their work by generating a scoping study that pulls together existing evidence about the role of local faith actors in that domain, but which also then begins to identify research and policy gaps as well. So there are a number of those scoping studies available on the JLI website. So the hubs have focused on a range of areas. So there has been a hub that's currently has been in abeyance and is now coming back on peace and conflict. Again, one on refugees and forced migration that's being revived, one on anti-human trafficking and modern slavery that I co-chair with colleagues from the Salvation Army that has an academic and a non-academic co-chair. And there's also been a hub on gender-based violence as well. So more recently, you know, over the last few years, since the COVID pandemic, JLI has made a concerted effort to decolonise its activities, and it's introduced an initiative that it calls its Fair and Equitable Initiative. And this has involved setting up regional learning hubs, almost as mirrors of the global hubs that I've just mentioned on refugees and forced migration, anti-human trafficking and modern slavery, to set up regional learning hubs, to move away from a model which can be very difficult to escape because of where resources are concentrated, where the earlier model, where these have tended to be led by scholars and practitioners in the global north. So for instance, as I said, I've been one of the 2 co-chairs or 3 co-chairs of the anti-human trafficking and modern slavery hub since about 2018. But we're now in the process of setting up a regional hub in Southeast Asia. And we've begun, or they've begun, the activities for that regional hub with a project that's been working with Buddhist monks to find out more about how they are supporting forced migrants and trafficked people from Myanmar into Thailand, so on the border between Myanmar and Thailand. You know, there are Buddhist temples and the monks are inevitably involved in different kinds of humanitarian activities. And we've been running what we've called listening dialogues, where local faith actors are invited to share their experiences, to discuss what evidence already exists that they know of that addresses the challenges that they're facing, and what new research needs to be undertaken from their point of view. So we're just currently, our colleagues in Thailand are just currently writing up the results of the listening dialogues, and then we'll be able to move on to the hub will be able, the regional hub will be able to move on to the next step of thinking about what new research needs to be carried out, and you know, where the policy interventions would be most helpful within their region. So I urge you to have a look at the Joint Learning Initiative for Faith and Local Communities, to have a look at their website. It's an amazing resource of information, opportunities for networking on the topic of religion and international development, not just for academics, but also for faith actors, policymakers, practitioners, and so on.
Thank you, Emma. And Arash, a question on your research on and your engagement with both religious and secular actors. What do you see as some of the main obstacles to meaningfully engaging religious actors and perspectives in the work of development, and how might these be overcome? And also, Emma, if you would like to comment on this afterwards, you're most welcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very the scope of the question is very ambitious in terms of overcoming the challenge. But my experience is pretty modest in relation to what the question is asking. But I'll share a few thoughts. You know, with regard to secular actors, what I find is, like I mentioned earlier, I think the approach to religion is either, of course, one can have a negative approach to religion, which I think we are not looking at that. That's the kind of you know, approach that one usually would get from a secular actor. But assuming that the person is open to engaging with religion, I think the challenge becomes that from within a secular framework of thought, either there is a tendency to view religion in an instrumental way, as a means to some other end, or there is a tendency to view religion as to exoticize religion, to make religion into something static and museumize it. I think the challenge is to that I found in my interactions with secular actors is to arrive at an understanding and develop a common language where we can talk and think about religion as a living system of knowledge that is constantly adapting itself to changing realities, that informs people's sense of identity, their system of ethics, and that constantly involves negotiation. I mean, people are engaged in learning how to apply their convictions or their beliefs in a rapidly changing world, both as individuals and as community. So somehow there seems to be the absence of that understanding is usually not there. And I think it's not an easy obstacle to overcome, because we don't have a language, we don't have a way of being able to describe religion in a way that does not do one of these two things which I mentioned earlier. And that in a sense leaves out the genius of religion, what makes religion what it is. The challenge with religious actors, on the other hand, is to somehow, which I have encountered with in my experience, is when one thinks of religion as a form, as an inspiration for social action, as against religion as a system of ethics, or religion as a body of practices and beliefs and orthodoxy. When one begins to think of religion as a set of ideas about how the world should be organized, about how relationships should be reordered, I find that requires religious actors to go beyond the historical frame that their religion has given them, and to somehow develop a vision that's well beyond their congregation, and not just their congregation, but also their history. You see, in a sense, once development is viewed as a process that has to embrace, let's say, the masses. For example, for India, if one were to think of a religious actor who is from the Hindu community, thinking of the development of India as a nation, it requires many leaps in their traditional, conventional way of thinking about religion, where religion is thought of in terms of a system of knowledge that caters to a specific congregation of believers, or a group of people who have decided to be part of that community. So I find that is one challenge, in a sense, to come out of the historical identities that religion have given shape to, and to think of my religion as a contributor to a common humanitarian mission of uplifting people all over the world and addressing their, their different social and economic and moral challenges, right? And also finding a language where I can articulate my convictions from which are grounded within, anchored within my own tradition, but yet which are accessible to people from different religious traditions, and indeed people who have no religious tradition. Like in a sense, finding a language that is authentic for me as a religious actor, and yet one that others can understand, can relate to. They may not be from the same tradition, but be able to connect with. So in a sense, developing, moving towards that vision and developing the language to articulate that vision, I think is one major challenge. The other challenge I find is for religious actors to begin to open the doors of their communities to science, and to begin to allow for many of their practices within their religious traditions to be questioned, to be maybe changed, to be reformed, and also to put aside some of these ideas which maybe for example might be superstitious, might like what Emma was sharing earlier, for example, certain ideas which are look down on women, for example. So to be able to allow for religion, people within a religious community, to be able to have that rational dialogue and process of reflection where religion is religious beliefs are allowed to interact with other systems of knowledge, and rational conclusions are arrived at. I think that's a big challenge, but I feel unless somehow these steps are taken, it's going to be difficult for religious and secular actors to come together on a common platform which, in a sense, which development requires.
Please go ahead, Emma. You wanted to share also.
Oh, thank you, Arash, for your comments there. And I think mine are going to very much build on what you've just mentioned. And there are sort of a couple of obstacles I want to refer to. I mean, one I've already talked, both I've probably already talked about, and I'm just going to go into it in a bit more detail. I think for me, the first obstacle to meaningful engagement is the tendency towards what we've been talking about, this instrumentalization of religion to serve Northern development goals that might not be in line with what actually matters to, what we're calling broadly here local communities. So I think this very much has meant that Northern donors and NGOs have sort of pick and choose which bits of religion they like and which bits they don't, and also tend to enter into some kind of evaluation of religion as either good or bad according to their criteria in terms of who they're more likely to want to form partnerships with and enter into dialogue with. In terms of which bits of religion Northern donors and NGOs don't really, secular NGOs seem to not really like very much. As I've already mentioned, I think there's a tendency to prefer religion when it's very passive and not expressive of faith community, of faith commitment and identity. You know, where the faith dimension is left in the background, it's bracketed, it's not something that's very explicit in engagement or partnerships. But I think going back to what Arash was just saying, I think this has tended to lead to a very narrow understanding of what religion is, a very narrow focus on religion, just in terms of its tangible assets that it brings to development. So things like financial resources, buildings, volunteers, moral frameworks, networks of trust, these things that can kind of be tied down and quantified, and much less attention to what it actually means for an individual to belong to a faith tradition and to be a believer. So what I've been calling in my work the intangible dimensions of religion and what they bring to development, humanitarianism, peace building, etc. So things like prayer and other kinds of rituals, there's much less interest in that within the mainstream development sector, which I think leads to a very narrow engagement with religion and a very narrow engagement with a particular type of religious actor who strategically doesn't express their faith identity in a very overt fashion. I think also Northern donors and NGOs often play a role, you know, it may even be, you know, implicit if not explicit, in terms of somehow classifying religion as good or bad. So, you know, just to give a very sort of simple, simplistic example, you know, for instance, a Muslim organisation that supports the version of Islam that views the veil, you know, the veiling for women as a matter of choice, or that men and women have equal roles and responsibilities, is perhaps much more likely to be favoured and trusted in terms of partnership formation, as it reflects a particular set of values or goals that are considered to represent progress. And then by contrast, you know, other kinds of organisations that might support versions of Islam that view the veil as compulsory, or talk about men and women in terms of having complementary roles, you know, roles that are equal but different, you know, might be much less likely to be selected as partners from the point of view of the donors, but indeed from the point of view of the faith actors, they might be much less likely to put themselves forward as partners due to this perception of clashing value systems. And again, I think that really limits engagement, it really limits partnership, it really limits the possibilities and potential of the role that religion can play in development. And this brings me to a second obstacle that I've also alluded to, where for both secular and faith actors, gender in particular is the topic where tensions and clashes can arise. And more specifically, one of the most difficult topics these days seems to be around LGBTQI+ issues, where for many faith actors, they simply can't see a way to support LGBTQI+ rights, whereas for secular actors, it's non-negotiable not to support this. And, you know, my own personal values sit at that end. You know, I would also agree that they're non-negotiable, but would recognise that for others, this is a very difficult issue. And I think this is particularly difficult considering, you know, we're hearing a lot in the media these days. There are a lot of examples of the rolling back of the very slim rights that many LGBTQI+ persons have possessed in their settings. So I'm thinking, for instance, about Uganda in particular, and the role that faith actors play in this. You know, they do play a role. They also play a role in opposing it. But, you know, faith actors are also complicit in the rolling back of LGBTQI+ rights. So I'm not sure there's really a straightforward answer to this, but it seems likely that in order to form productive partnerships with faith actors, there isn't going to be complete agreement on all areas. At times, engagement might need to be strategic according to the particular issue being considered. And at the same time, I've heard faith actors saying how difficult they actually find it when by default they're expected to support approaches to gender and sexuality when they enter into partnerships with donors and secular NGOs that they actually find very hard to agree with. And that they wish that this didn't have to become a focus of tension so early on in the relationship, when there would be so many other areas that they could productively and successfully work on. So I think this is a really tricky issue that, again, that I think we need to pay more attention to in order for religion to, you know, play a productive role in development.
Thank you, Emma and Arash. And continue with this, building on this conversation, I would like to share a question for both of you. The impulse to envision, learn about, and strive towards higher degrees of progress is intrinsic to humankind. Ideas about what constitutes progress and how it can be achieved, and collective efforts to this end, are as numerous and diverse as humanity itself, and form part of the heritage of all nations and peoples of the world. Many will agree the statement that for the development field to make meaningful progress, we will need to draw on the accumulated knowledge and wisdom of humanity in the moral domain. What are ways of viewing religion that make it possible to draw on religion as a source of knowledge for development? So, Arash, we can start with you. If you want.
I was hoping you would ask Emma hear what she had to say, but maybe I can just share a few short comments. I think, in a sense, if one goes back, like, again, I think from a developing world context, if one goes back to the pre-modern India, right, the India that had religion as the system of knowledge, that was really organizing all aspects of life, and that was central to social life as well. And if one asks oneself, well, what you know, how were the different processes of life somehow aligned with this conception of religion? One sees that it had a role in people's economic life. For example, the way people engaged in agriculture, their relationships with their family, the extended family, the way they formed communities, all the practices that they engaged in was very much in alignment with their religious conviction. Then you have the process of modernization, which was this great, in some ways, really wonderful process as well, because it in a sense put people into a process of rapid change. The problem with that process was it did not allow people, or people were not, the people, in this case, Indian people that I'm thinking of, perhaps were not empowered enough to decide how they want to modernize and on what terms, and what they do with their pre-existing or their pre-modern or their traditional system of knowledge, which was really religion. So what ended up happening is you had this great split between the private and the public in people's lives. And people, the organic connection which existed between someone's spiritual convictions and all the other aspects of life, that broke. And now life became fragmented. You went to work, you had one system of ethics there. At home, you had, you know, your religion came into play. And so on. Now, I think the question, if one were to ask how religion would become, would be a system of knowledge, for me, the question is, if one goes back to that woman or that man who let's say was going through this process of India's transformation, if that person was empowered to decide how he or she is going to bring his or her convictions into alignment with this great global force of scientific progress and technological development, and what aspects of his or her belief system needs to be adapted, needs to evolve. How would they see the application of their beliefs, which earlier maybe was restricted to a village, now to a global village? What would it mean for the way they conceive of different ideas which are fundamental to religion? What kind of change would it call for? I think when that, to my understanding, is religion being a system of knowledge, that process that a person in a sense goes through as an individual is an analogy of what a whole society would need to do if they are engaging with religion as a system of knowledge. A community would need to do. And I think we, in a sense, India missed the bus. We didn't do it, but we can go back and do it. You see, in a sense, we can now, we can, like Kerry's introduction says, there's been a turn towards religion. There's the political face of religion is very strong now in India. This is an opportunity to go back to ask, well, what is religion? What does one want it to be? How does religion describe itself? What are the the norms that religion sets for true religion, right? And in a sense, then to take ownership of our own beliefs, our own, in a sense, to make religion a mass movement, but not a mass movement of just followers, but a mass movement of knowers, of doers.
Okay, yes. Okay. So I'll just sort of briefly add some comments to this. Thanks, Arash. So how can we draw on religion as a source of knowledge in the development process? I think, as Arash has already mentioned, there's often a clash between secular development knowledges and religious knowledge, where aspects of the latter, of secular development knowledge, can be in tension with religious knowledge, given in particular the centrality of what we might call unseen forces and the intangible effects of prayer and other rituals. And to date, there's been very little research, and I am very interested to look at the report, Arash, that you've written about spirituality and water resources. But in general, there's very little research on the role of spirituality and prayer in development, humanitarianism and peace building, or indeed even about the overlaps or fault lines between secular and religious knowledge and development, and how we might better navigate this terrain. There's a wonderful article by Erin Wilson, a wonderful journal article, where she discusses this as a form of both epistemological and ontological violence against local communities, where alternative knowledge systems and understandings of what exists are viewed as insignificant. She argues that the religion and development domain really needs to reflect upon this and to find other ways of accommodating and entering into dialogue about these different epistemological and ontological systems and reference points. And I've spotted that my wonderful PhD student, Sina Ramanian, is in the audience here. And you'll be hearing much more on this topic when he publishes his PhD, which is looking at development knowledge within Baha'i tradition and secular scientific knowledge within the mainstream world of development. So I think this is a very relevant an up and coming issue that we need to address. And in terms of my own research, you know, what we might be broadly calling different epistemological and ontological frameworks, I'm just beginning a new project that will be examining the role of prayer in faith-based peace building. As I mentioned at the start, when religion's been considered in peace building, it's tended to be in terms of the very tangible resources or assets that it brings, and the intangible, the spiritual, prayer, etc., tends to be marginalized in accounts of what makes faith-based peace building effective, not really from the point of view of the faith activists, but on behalf of how it's been reported by international peace builders and also by academics. So our project is going to be based in Sri Lanka, the Philippines, and Burundi, and is funded by the British Academy. So we're literally just beginning this now. So I've not done any work on sort of sociology of prayer before, so I'm very excited to be following this stream as it develops within religion and development, and making a contribution to it myself. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Arash. This has been a fascinating conversation, and we're already at the end of our time, but if the audience will bear with us a few minutes longer, I'd like to close with just one more question. We're asking all of our speakers in this series the same big picture question. So as our world faces crisis after crisis, from climate change to rising global inequality, there's growing recognition that we need to rethink strategies for development in ways that are more environmentally sustainable, equitable, just, and participatory. There's also growing recognition that development is not just something that needs to happen in the so-called global South, but true transformation requires changes in the essential relationships that underpin all societies. So to close this second conversation of our Rural Transformation series, what final thoughts would each of you offer in just 1 minute or two for how we need to reimagine development to meet the challenges of the 21st century? Emma, could we start with you?
Yes, no problem, that's fine. So yeah, a great question. And in terms of where I am with my own research at the moment, I'm particularly interested in the sort of decolonial moments that we're seeming to be living through. So, following the very tragic murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, it's had a tremendous effect on all kinds of sectors in terms of thinking about decolonization. But I think it's not only important to think about decolonization in terms of development broadly, but also for how we think about the relationship between religion and development. There's been some excellent work done by charities, done by organizations such as Charity So White. Charity So White is an organization that looks at racism within the voluntary and charity sector. And many organizations are beginning to not only think about how they might decolonize their work, but also about their colonial legacies as well. And this is just as important for faith-based organizations as it is for secular organizations. So I think many faith-based organizations are beginning this work, these conversations internally, but we don't know much yet about how the faith-based sector is responding overall. And I'm just beginning a research project with the Joint Learning Initiative for Faith and Local Communities about how local faith actors working in development view this concept of decolonization, how they're operationalizing it in their work, and the challenges and advantages of faith actors engaging on this topic. And just one final point linked to the decolonization question, I think we're also being forced to rethink the recent trend towards localizing aid, where the rhetoric has been used about localization, but genuine localization in terms of, really financing local organizations and listening and taking into account and shifting the power balance to take consideration of their views and perspectives still has a really long way to go. And I've just written a paper with Olivia Wilkinson, the Director of Research at the JLI, that examines this for local faith actors in South Sudan, where despite very strong localization rhetoric, our research with them demonstrated that they're rarely viewed as legitimate humanitarian actors by the international aid system. And in fact, part of the project that we were working on involved humanitarian skills workshops for local faith actors in order to enable them to become legitimate in a way that meets the standards of the international community. And I think the reasons why they're not viewed as legitimate is due to a number of factors, including fears over proselytization, as I've already mentioned, and a perception perhaps that their informal status means that they won't meet humanitarian standards and principles, that they don't know about the language of development, that they're perhaps more likely to support members of their own faith community rather than others. And our research has demonstrated a lot more knowledge and capacity than local faith actors are normally given credit for. And nonetheless, you know, there's a great desire to become viewed as legitimate within the aid system that we currently have. So thanks so much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed the questions and the conversations. And thanks also to Arash as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Arash?
Yes, I just wanted to share a short comment on the process of development, how development has, as an enterprise, has historically over the past so many decades, how it has been delivered in a sense. And one sees that basically the actors have mainly been either civil, development organizations or the state. And that model of delivering development from an expert to beneficiary communities or individuals has had disastrous consequences. I mean, one can look at, for example, the Green Revolution, which was the most well-meaning set of policies for the material advancement of community, but it had all kinds of ramifications which the original proposer, those who came up with the set of policies that were part of the Green Revolution, did not foresee. And today we are dealing with all the challenges that in India, for example, that came out of that set of policies. And this is the case with so many development programs and policies where the intentions are noble, but then the process does not incorporate a process of learning. And so I think one thing that we have learned is that development, if it is to really result in the transformation of social, economic, and spiritual conditions of the masses, the locus of development has to be with the people themselves. It is along with the state, the market, the civil society, all of them have their role. But the initiators of development should be the beneficiaries themselves. In other words, populations have to take charge of their own destiny. And it is only then that this gap between cause and effect in delivery of development programs, this loop can be closed and closed much faster. In other words, rather than development being a package which is delivered and in a sense it's dropped on a population, it becomes a process that a population learns about through their own process of learning. Now, for that to happen, you need institutional structures at the community level, at the level of the micro region, the region, at different levels, in order to allow for one, for capacity to be built within populations to be able to do it, and for that knowledge then to be systematized. And I think just before ending, the question then comes of what are the systems of knowledge that the masses would draw upon in this process of you know, a humanity-wide participation in pursuing spiritual and material prosperity. I think those systems of knowledge are first the science. I mean, clearly science has to be there to help people understand you know, the issues that face them, to read their reality with accuracy and to come up with workable solutions for the issues that face them. It has to include indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, which the communities have developed over you know, over centuries, and where they've learned how to you know, most efficiently carry out certain processes which are in harmony with their environment, with their moral convictions. But also the third system of knowledge would be religion itself, that somehow they have to also be empowered to be able to draw upon religion as a system of knowledge that sheds light on spiritual reality, and bring it together with science and with their local knowledge and indigenous knowledge in order to trace their own path of development.
Wonderful, wonderful concluding thoughts. And so now we can close our second conversation on religion and development. A big thank you to our featured speakers, Emma Tomalin and Arash Fazli. We are grateful for the time and insights you shared with us today. We're also grateful to the Center on Modernity and Transition and the Duke Center for International Development for co-hosting this seminar series, and to the Social Science Research Council for supporting the Rural Development and the Capability to Stay project.
Please join us for our next conversation in this series on local knowledge, global change on June 30th. We will see you then.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you very much.